Okay, in this video, I'm going to introduce some symbolization. You won't need to be able to do symbolization of arguments, but it's useful for me to be able to quickly write on the board in an abstract way sometimes, and the symbols help with that. They're also good. It's a good skill to acquire because it can help you keep track of your reasoning better, and it can also act as a nice kind of shorthand when you're taking notes in any kind of argumentative discipline. So capital letters stand for atomic declarative sentences. So what's an atomic sentence? An atomic sentence is a sentence that just says one thing. So if I say my sweater is green and large, I've said two things about my sweater. One statement I've made is, in effect, my sweater is green. Another one I've made is, in effect, my sweater is large. That's not an atomic declarative sentence because it has two parts. It's basically saying two things. A declarative sentence is atomic when it just says one thing. And remember, declarative sentences are just sentences that say something about the world. So use capital letters to stand for these. So like the letter P, for example, could stand for my sweater is green. And the letter Q could stand for my sweater is large. And, or you can use an ampersand. This symbol here, an upside down caret, or an ampersand stands for and. So if I wanted to say my sweater is green and large, I could write P for my sweater is green, Q for my sweater is large, and put this symbol in between them. That would be P and Q. The V stands for or. So if I wrote P or Q, that would be my sweater is large, or, sorry, my sweater is green or my sweater is large. This little tilde symbol stands for not. So if I wrote not P, that would be my sweater is not green. And the arrow stands for if then. So if I wrote P then Q, I'd be saying if my sweater is green, then my sweater is large. When you do the arrow in both directions, it's saying P implies Q and Q implies P. So it's like saying my sweater, if my sweater is green, then it's large, and if it's large, then it's green. And then you can use parentheses to group prepositions. We're not going to worry so much about that. I'm not going to walk through this entire sheet. It's here for you to look at. Basically, it's just showing you how this works. So if the letter A stands for tomatoes or vegetables, then not A, this little symbol then A stands for tomatoes are not vegetables. If the letter A stands for tomatoes or fruit and the letter B stands for red peppers or fruit, then you could write A, this symbol B, to indicate tomatoes are fruit and red peppers are fruit. And so on down the list here. You can pause and look through the list and see how you would write various propositions. Now, valid forms. Here's some valid forms of argumentation. That is, these are forms of argumentation such that the premises guarantee the conclusion. They're good forms of argumentation. It doesn't mean the premises you're using are true because, P or Q might stand for a false premise, for example. It means that the form of the reasoning is good. So if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. So some of these people have an easy time understanding, and some of these people have a harder time understanding. Let's start with what I think is one of the most fundamental principles of human reasoning that people typically have an easy time understanding, and that's called modus ponens. You won't need to know these names. I just put them here in case you're interested. So P arrow Q says if P then Q. That's premise one. Premise two says P. Then the conclusion, this line indicates a conclusion's coming, says Q. So what this is saying is P implies Q, put another way, if P then Q, P therefore Q. And that's a valid form of argument. Any argument that has that form is valid regardless of what P and Q stand for. Why? Because it's saying P guarantees you're going to get to Q, you have P. And that just means you've guaranteed to get to Q. That's one people typically have an easy time understanding. Here's another one down below it that people typically have an easy time understanding. What it says is, if you know P is true, and you know Q is true, then you know P is true. You could have just as easily put Q there. It's not a super interesting form of argument, but I want you to think about it. It should be obvious. If I know my sweater is green, and I know my sweater is large, then I know my sweater is green. You can think of it as just like a version of self-implication, really. Next up, modus tollens. Now, this is one people sometimes have trouble with, so I'm going to actually skip it and come back to it in a minute and go over to hypothetical syllogism, which people typically have an easier time with. This is kind of like the principle of transitivity in math. It says, if you know that P gives you Q, and you know that Q gives you R, then you know that P gives you R. Why? Well, if you have P, you're going to get to Q. If you have Q, you're going to get to R, which means if you have P, you're going to end up at R. So P gives you R. Intuitively, that's a plausible form of inference. Over here next, disjunctive syllogism. What the or in logic says is at least one of these are true. And that's importantly different than saying that at most one of them is true. If I say at most one of them is true, then what I'm saying is when you learn one is true, you know the other one isn't. If I say instead at least one of them is true, then learning that one of them is true doesn't tell you anything about the other one. Maybe it's true, maybe it isn't. Because when you say at least one is true, you're allowing for the possibility that both are true. And when we use this symbol in logic, we use it to mean at least one of the two things is true. So what this argument says is at least one of these two is true. This first one here isn't true, so we're stuck with the other one, right? So if I know either P is true or Q is true, and then I learn that P isn't true, well, then I know that Q must be true. Okay, now back to the one people sometimes have trouble with. It is also a valid form of argument. It's no less valid than any of the other forms. But psychologically, it's a little trickier for some people. So here's how it goes. P guarantees Q, but you don't have Q, so you couldn't have gotten to P. So you can think of it like this. Sometimes examples make this easier. If you're a sister, then you're a sibling. But you're not a sibling, so you can't have been a sister. Anytime you know that P guarantees you're going to get to Q, but you didn't get to Q, you know you couldn't have been at P. Okay? Often you need to think through lots of examples before that becomes clear, but it is a valid rule, and it's an important valid rule. You can think of the argument we looked at earlier as being represented this way. So the argument was, if that was 5 minutes, then I wouldn't be arguing, but I am arguing, so that wasn't 5 minutes. That's an instance of this form of argument. This one is the hardest one to understand. Let's go with this one here. This says, if you know P is true on one line of your argument, like number 1, P, number 2, Q, so you know Q is true on another line, then you can stick them on the same line. You can say number 3, P and Q. So this is like saying, look, I know my sweater is green, and I also know my sweater is large. Therefore, I know my sweater is green and large. Skip addition because people find that confusing. This one is tricky, but people tend to find it intuitive once they get their mind around it. What it says is this. If we know that P gives us Q, and we know that R gives us S, so we know both of those things. We know P implies Q and R implies S. And we also know that at least one of these true, P, R, is true, so at least one of those is right. Then we know that at least one of these is right. So why is that? Well, here's the idea. We know P gives us Q and we know R gives us S. So if you have P, you've got to get Q. If you have R, you've got to get S. We know that P or R is true, which means at least one of these is true because these are P and R. Well, if P is the one that's true, we're going to get Q. If R is the one that's true, we're going to get S. At least one of those two is true, which means at least one of these two must be true. And that's what the conclusion says. It says at least one of those two is true. I don't expect you, by the way, to master all of these forms immediately. What I'm primarily concerned with right now is that you understand that some forms of argument are such that if you have a certain set of premises with a certain form, any conclusion with a relevant form is guaranteed to be right. That is, if the premises are right, then the conclusion must be right. It follows deductively. Now let's come look at addition. This one's tricky. We will not use this until close to the end of the semester. What it says is this. And really, I just have it here because if you understand the meaning of or, you can understand this argument. Or to put it another way, once you understand this argument, it will drive home the meaning of or for you. So what this argument says is this. If you know premise P is true, so I know this one here is true, then I know this is true. I know either P is true or Q is true. So why is that? Well, the reason is actually quite simple. If I know P is true, then I know this formula is true because if P is true, then this formula is true. Why? Because this formula says at least one of these is right. And if I know this one's right, then I know at least one of these is right. So if I know I am a person, then, whoops, let me go back to that. Then I know either I'm a person or the moon is made of cheese. Why? Because the sentence, either I'm a person or the moon is made of cheese, is made true by the fact that I am a person because that sentence, either I'm a person or the moon is made of cheese, only requires that one of them be true. And I already know which one is, I already know that one of them is true. Okay, so we're going to stop there, and in the next video, there'll be some, well, actually, I shouldn't say in the next video. There's some examples here. I'm not even going to walk through them with you. They're just on the slides if you want to do some practice with valid and sound and symbolization. I'm sort of like going through the slides quickly, but you can go through the slides slowly. And what you might do, for example, here is take this first argument and try and determine, is it valid, is it sound, symbolize it, do the same thing for the second argument, and so on and so forth. And there's a series of examples on these slides that you can walk through. Okay, I'm going to stop this video there.